if you are going to grow a business of any kind, like you need to have some way that people discover you. I work with a lot of people who teach or coach or consult or things like that. And so they have some kind of expertise and they're helping other people do that thing or learn to do that thing. One of the tensions is that people often feel like, well, do I give away all my content or like all my ideas and my information in my content, or doesn't that like cannibalize my course sales or my client sales? And I think that actually, yes, I think a lot of times people will give you this advice of like, oh, no, like there's always people will pay to have it in, whatever, the full version of it, the complete version of it in the right order. And like, I think that is true to some extent, but I also think just teaching on your podcast or your Instagram feed or your newsletter, I think that does make it harder to convert people into clients.
That is today's guest, Jeremy Enns. He is the guy I go to for podcasting advice, for brainstorming, and there's a reason he's helped clients generate millions of dollars. He has a very high-level view of what is working for location-independent businesses in terms of content creation. What are the things that are organically going to bring in the right paying customers? And I think this is relevant even if you don't have a business, because we talk about a ton of different things in this conversation. Of course, content-wise, you're going to hear the difference between content creators and business owners who create content, why it's important to understand which you are, the smartest way to create content, some advice for people that feel like they need to create a certain type of content to get in front of their audience, but really don't like that thing, whether that's making videos, writing, podcasting, or something else, which are all mediums that come up today. An awesome rule of thumb for how to create content, how to find your voice. This is where we get into some of the advice that can really apply to anybody. And Jeremy has done all this as a nomad. He's been slow traveling for over the last 8 years. So you're going to get this advice from somebody who's been living the travel lifestyle. And you're going to hear about destinations he spent quality time in, including one area of the world he has spent 2 years. So you might want to get this area on your radar. Plenty of travel talk in this one and much more. Plus, part 2 of our road trip planning series. I'll share my top 3 outstanding overland trips, which you're going to use along with a simple exercise to begin brainstorming your own outstanding trip in the coming year. All of that and much more happening right now. So buckle up, strap in. Thanks for being here, and welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend.
You're listening to the Zero to Travel podcast, where we explore exciting travel-based work, lifestyle, and business opportunities, helping you to achieve your wildest travel dreams. And now your host, world wanderer and travel junkie, Jason Moore.
Hey there, it's Jason here with ZeroToTravel.com. Welcome to the show. Thanks for hanging out, letting me bring a little travel into your ears today. This is the show to help you travel the world on your terms, to fill your life with as much travel as you desire, no matter what your situation or experience. And these location-independent business trends today, probably more geared towards the solopreneur type, somebody that's building what we might call a lifestyle business that can help you sustain your travels that you can do on the road. And whether this would be your first business, a pivot in an existing business, your next business or product or service, maybe you're somebody who's just looking to find their voice and express themselves. I think there is a lot going on in this conversation that will help you out. And as I mentioned at the top, Jeremy really knows what he's talking about. He's a guy that I call for advice. And you can check out his work over at podcastmarketingacademy.com. If you're getting into podcasting, really encourage you to sign up for his podcast newsletter. And he has a website over at counterweightcreative.co, as well as jeremyenns.com for various links. And that's ENNS for his last name. We're going to get into it right now. And don't forget, we got that road trip mini-series segment coming your way. And I'll leave you with a quote as well. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the other side, my friend. Cheers. Jeremy Enns, welcome to the Zero to Travel podcast, my friend. It has been way too long, although we talk about once a month, so it hasn't been long for us, but it's been long since we've recorded something. So anyway, welcome back to the show, man.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I think I was just having a flashback. I think the last time that I was on was with my now wife, Kelly, then partner. We were in Belgrade. It was probably, I don't know, about a year into COVID, something like that. And I remember the moment well.
Yeah, nice. Well, I mean, we can link up to that. And yeah, we recorded a great episode with you and your now wife, as you mentioned. Congratulations, because I got to go to the wedding, which was an
You got to
online
speak at the
wedding.
wedding.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a second. But
Okay.
just so you know, as the listener, this is all about you. And how could it not be? Because this is what Jeremy has been coaching people about in terms of content creation for a very long time. It's like, hey, we got to focus on giving the audience value. And so I'm like, this is a no-brainer to have you back on, man, because I know you got a ton to share, because you are essentially helping, we can say, focusing on solopreneurs using business. And in this case, I could say to make travel or maybe a certain lifestyle sustainable. I think some of the things you're going to share today can apply to different size businesses as well. But it's just that idea of like leveraging content creation as a way to perhaps attract the right paying customers, as a way to align with your values, as a way to provide value to people, and in return build a business around that. So that's kind of like the stuff we're covering. And I'm going to get off my soapbox in a minute. I always love to have people on that have like a meta perspective of the landscape, and because you are training people around this stuff with the Podcast Marketing Academy, and I don't want people to get turned off by that, because like, although you focus on podcasts, really at the core of it is like it's using the podcast to help build the business. So there's a lot around this. You can clarify everything I'm saying, but is that pretty much kind of like what we're going to cover today in terms of trends for 2025 to help people stay ahead of sort of like those location independent business trends, solopreneur trends, to help them build their first or grow their business in 2025?
Yeah. And so to kind of add a little bit onto that. So yeah, I've been in the podcasting world for coming up on 10 years now. Actually, I think 2025 will be the 10-year anniversary. But I've always been a writer. So I have historically, I've hosted many podcasts. I currently have one right now, which actually weirdly is, well, I kind of have two right now. One's in between seasons, and that's like a traditional audio podcast. The other one is, I don't know if I should even call it a podcast or it's a YouTube channel, but it's going to be a podcast. But right now it's only available on YouTube. And then I have written, I don't know, hundreds of newsletters and blog posts over the past 10 years. And so I've kind of been involved with kind of all kind of modes of content creation, and really identify first and foremost as a writer. I've been on, all the social media platforms. Right now, I've actually kind of pulled back from all the social media platforms and have had a lot more success in the business. And we can get into why that might be and if and how that might work for you. But then also this year for me, I've essentially built two successful businesses to some extent. The first one was a podcast production agency. And then as that kind of like the podcasting ecosystem progressed, that was really easy to get clients at the start. There's all kinds of things that I didn't really set that business up for long-term success. Then we can maybe get into that if that's interesting. But over time, it kind of morphed into the teaching, consulting, coaching side of things, which is now the main business and is kind of eclipsed the agency. Is basically we've got a few clients left. But there's two different business models, and I think both are kind of interesting, looking at like how one got me started in my location independent career. The other one kind of took over after that. But I guess maybe it's safe to say that I've like done all the things kind of, and obviously a lot of there's personal preferences here, but would love to chat about some of the things that I've seen both for myself and for my clients. And probably you've got some things that you can share on those fronts as well. Yeah,
that's great. Thanks for the overview. Yeah, because you had this productized service, you could call it, with the podcast production agency. Like you said, you now have the teaching, consulting, coaching thing, and then you've covered a wide variety of content creation methods is the wrong word, but yeah, like the platforms, I guess, and high quality stuff. Like if you want a great newsletter about podcasting, the Scrappy Podcasting newsletter, we can link up to it. I mean, I basically read, I'm a professional podcaster. I'm like, I can say that. I'm one of the lucky few. And I read two newsletters regularly, and it's yours and Pod News. They're the best ones out there. So I just wanted to give you props for that and say thanks for the work over there. Yeah, I think this is going to be valuable in terms of like, I mean, at this point, it does feel like every business has to be creating some type of content in some ways, for better or worse, right? Like that doesn't mean everybody's a quote unquote influencer or like a professional content creator, whatever you want to call it. You have to get in front of people. And it seems that although there are businesses out there that don't do that, you can think about many mega successful businesses, I'm sure, that just operate behind closed doors. But there are a lot of businesses that need to attract customers through these platforms. So I'm excited to dig into this. But dude, first I have to say congratulations on the wedding. I wanted to just talk about it because I was there. I was honored. You asked me to speak a little bit, which was super nice to be a part of the ceremony. And it was online. And I was thinking, I was easily going to get into the talk, but I was like, are we going to be engaged in the wedding? Like, am I going to be emotional? Like, it's online. That's totally different. I've never been to an online wedding, but I bawled the whole time. It was like the most emotional wedding I've been to, and I have no idea why. I'm like, why am I crying? So anyway, kudos. Well done. How does it feel to be a married man?
To be honest, like everybody always tells you it's going to feel different. I feel no different whatsoever. So I'm maybe the outlier here, but yeah, I feel like Kelly and I, we met through the Location Indie community many years ago, and we then knew each other for a couple of years, had worked together a couple times, and then we ultimately met up in person maybe 2 years into once we knew each other, and then have been together ever since. And yeah, we just always had a lot of fun together. And at some point it became clear, like, okay, whether or not we were getting married or not, like we were definitely going to be together for, the long term. And so it just kind of felt like it was already a foregone conclusion. And this was the kind of formality of it.
Two amazing individuals, I will say, two close friends. And I don't want to pass over the lifestyle piece because obviously this is a travel podcast and we're going to talk about these sort of solopreneur focused business trends. But you guys have been nomadic for many years and you've been traveling around doing this. So can you just give everybody an overview of, you mentioned all the businesses and the things you're involved with, but you're not doing this from your, home office in your hometown. You've been doing this from all over the world. Yeah. Just share a little bit about the journey, the nomad journey, how it's been for you, kind of where you're at with that right now.
Yeah. So I guess I left. So I was living in Vancouver, Canada. And when I kind of got into this whole world, I had taken it's actually the 10-year anniversary as we're recording this of the first big trip that I did. And so a friend of mine, we saved up for like 2 years, something like that. And we probably didn't need to save up that much for this trip. But essentially we went on a 4-month cycle tour through Europe. And so we did 2 weeks in Iceland, and then we flew to Oslo. I don't know if we wouldn't have known each other. You might not have been there actually yet either, but we flew to Oslo and then we cycled to Croatia. And then after that, I'd met a woman who I was dating at the time, kind of right before that trip, just like worst possible timing. And then, so we cut the cycle trip was initially going to be a year-long trip. I'm curious if we would have made it that far. I think we had thoughts of like doing the full round the world cycle tour. That didn't end up happening. But then after this tour ended, I went and flew to Southeast Asia, met up with her, and we traveled for another kind of 4 or 5 months. So that was 2014, and so kind of took a year and off and traveled, and kind of came back from that and was like, oh, how do I do that more? How do I do that all the time? And at the time, 2014, there wasn't really a lot of content out there, as you're very well aware, as that's kind of around the time, kind of 2015, that Location Indie was hatched and the Paradise Pack was going on back then. And there was all these kind of things that you and Travis were creating, that I kind of somehow discovered the world of both podcasting and location independence, as it was like very new on the scene, and kind of quickly started going down that rabbit hole. That was maybe 2015, 16, something like that. But essentially, I had a background in audio engineering, and I think it was after a conversation with you, kind of talking about podcast editing and stuff like that. And I was like, it took me a while, and I was like, wait, I guess I could do that. I didn't think I had the skills that would translate into a location independent job. I always thought like, okay, audio engineering needs a studio and like all the gear and all the stuff. And at some point my perspective shifted, and I was like, oh wait, I can do this. And pretty quickly I got a bunch of clients, enough to kind of equal my day job. And within kind of 6 months, really, I had enough to go start traveling full time. So that was fall of 2016, I believe. And essentially now it's been 8 years, and we've kind of been all over the place. First couple of years on my own, then 6 years or so with Kelly. And now we've actually just 2 weeks ago, I got my residency card for Spain in Barcelona. So we've been here about a year, kind of navigating the bureaucracy, not quite sure that we would be able to get through and be settled. But now it seems like it's official. So we're going to be here for the at least medium future.
Okay, yeah. So after 8 years, basically, of being nomadic, you are settling down in another country, basically, and living abroad, which is super exciting for you guys. And it'll be not, I can't wait to come visit you there, by the way. I think also you've been doing it pretty slowly in terms of slow travel, kind of, setting up, making it sustainable, staying in apartments and places for months on end, which, after 8 years on the road, I can imagine that's kind of a necessity. But I just love that we're talking about this completely other topic here today. And like, oh, by the way, like Jeremy went on cycled from Oslo to Croatia and he was a nomad for 8 years. It's just like, let's circle back on the nomad journey, because I want to hear, 3 or 4 of your sort of like favorite places that you've spent time, places that you might recommend people spend time. And I'm sure that might tie in with some of the business stuff, because when you're traveling and running a business like that, you can't help but, kind of like some of these things are intertwined. But let's dig into the sort of these trends. I don't know if you want to call this like a snappy thing, like, X amount of trends for solopreneurs or whatever, or we could just kind of dive in and just start kind of having a conversation around this, because we want to look at the things that are more specific to the coming year and what, in your opinion, might be different or start, maybe the tide's turning, or there's some kind of new way to approach these things that you're just starting to see people that are successful doing, but not enough people are doing. Maybe that's a good way to kind of approach it.
Yeah, I think so. The first thing I want to circle back to something that you kind of briefly mentioned a little bit earlier, where talking about like, not everybody's an influencer or a professional content creator. Some people, you do aspire to that. And I suppose the terminology wasn't really around probably back when I started traveling, but like I wanted to be a travel photographer. And so I didn't really know what that meant, but I wanted to take photos. I wanted to travel. That was the thing that I wanted to do. And I wanted to somehow get paid for that. And so I think now that would be some kind of content creator, even though that wasn't really a thing at the time. And, I did some YouTube vlogging at the time. I did writing about photography. So there was this kind of like blogger, content creator type of thing that I was looking to do. And I think it's worth distinguishing, like that whole type of business model has really taken off, the kind of like professional content creator side of things. And I think it's worth distinguishing the difference between content created to be a content creator or influencer, whatever term you prefer, and content that is content marketing for your business. And I think that a lot of people, because there's been so much hype around like being a content creator, that's how people think they need to create content. But they're actually two very different strategies. And so one of the things that I'm seeing with a lot of clients, where when you have like, let's say like an online course or a service you provide or something like that, service may be a little bit different, but like an online course in particular, I work with a lot of people who teach or coach or consult or things like that. And so they have some kind of expertise and they're helping other people do that thing or learn to do that thing. One of the tensions is that people often feel like, well, do I give away all my content in or like all my ideas and my information in my content, or doesn't that like cannibalize my course sales or my client sales? And I think that actually, yes, I think a lot of times people will give you this advice of like, oh, no, like there's always people will pay to have it in, whatever, the full version of it, the complete version of it in the right order. And like, I think that is true to some extent, but I also think just teaching on your podcast or your Instagram feed or your newsletter, I think that does make it harder to convert people into clients. And so I think like one of the things that you have to kind of think about when it comes to content creation is, if you are a content creator, you have a very different business model, which is dependent on you getting as many views and as many followers as possible. You're not trying to like hold anything back. And so you're just trying to get as big an audience as possible. And so you are incentivized to give away the farm, to give away as much information, all the information that everyone else might hold back and keep behind paid kind of closed doors. A content creator is like, no, I win if I make this all free, because then I get the eyeballs and people get something that maybe somebody else is charging them $1,000 for. I'm going to give it away for free. And so people are going to view my content. And so then I get the advertising or the sponsored dollars or things like that. And so for a content creator, you actually want to give away as much as possible and, make the best quality content possible, the highest resolution, the most information that you can, or whatever. It doesn't necessarily need to be information, but like give away the most value possible. Whereas if you're a business owner, especially one who is teaching other people how to do something, it actually does not behoove you to give away all the information, because now you have nothing left to sell. And so I think that understanding which camp you fall into is a really important first step to say, if I'm doing content marketing for my business, I need to take a different content strategy than somebody who is looking to just get maximum number of eyeballs. And I would say, like, the business owner actually has a higher earning potential in most cases, depending on what your product is, but it's going to be a different content strategy. And so typically, like, where I would kind of draw the line here, or how I'm thinking about this right now, which seems to be, I'm starting to see a little bit of this. We're getting into trends, and I kind of have actually stumbled into this a bit myself, is if you are a business owner, I think a really smart way to create content is not to teach directly, but to just give examples. And so what you're looking to do is demonstrate your kind of core concepts without actually teaching in a structured way of like, here's this concept, here's how to apply it. It's more like taking something out in the wild and kind of diagnosing it or assessing it or analyzing it and saying, oh, see, here's why this thing works. Isn't this a cool idea here? And it's like proof that of your kind of methodology. And so an example for me is I have a co-host, Justin, and we do on our YouTube-based podcast, where we basically do these podcast roasts. And so our listeners submit their shows, and then the idea is, like, we do zero research. We kind of open it up and kind of go through the experience of a potential first listener. And so we open up the show kind of sight unseen, and we're like, okay, here's our first impressions. Here's what this cover art makes me think. The title's confusing. The description, I don't really get what this is about. Like, oh, these are, and there's good and bad. And so there's things that's like, oh, I really like what they're doing here, but this is losing me. And so this is an example, like, going through each show, every episode, it is not direct teaching, but it actually gives us a chance to talk about bigger concepts, but just in little snippets here and there. And like, this is still super valuable content. And it's actually very, I would say, kind of like complementary to more direct teaching kind of content, where a lot of times one of the challenges with direct kind of teaching is that people don't understand how to apply it. And so our show is a natural complement to other content that might be like, okay, here's this idea of like how to develop a show premise or show concept, and we can run through that. And that's something, that I teach and work with people to do. But it's interesting that, like, many of my clients watch the roast and they're like, oh, I finally got how that makes sense. Now that I watched through 15 different examples, and now I've kind of triangulated how this thing works. And so I think understanding, that's one way to do it. You see all kinds of, when you start looking for it, of like more business oriented content where it's like there's a business behind it. A lot of times it works a lot better when it's not direct teaching, but it's like, here's a person who exemplifies the things that we do teach, or it's we're kind of diagnosing or assessing something and giving our thoughts on it. And so these are all some kind of starting points of how to think about just the first step. Decide, like, which camp do you fall into? What is your business model, and what do you need? Do you need maximum views, or do you need a targeted amount of views who are then going to work their way through your kind of sales system?
Okay, cool. That makes a lot of sense. So from a sort of forward-thinking perspective in the coming year, basically you're telling people that they need to be more strategic about, like, really choosing a side or a camp, as you said in your words, and going kind of all in with the strategies that camp kind of comes with, I guess. I mean, when I read your newsletter, and I know you, and I see your content and I follow your work, but I know you personally. I know you're passionate about podcasting, and I'm just bringing this up because this doesn't fall into the trends discussion, but it falls into like the, should I just be creating content? Like, when you say as a business marketing arm, let's say, it sounds very, like, for some people, it might be kind of a drag. Like, oh, I feel like I have to get on the content bandwagon because it's just something you have to do, but they don't want to do it at all, or their heart's not into it, or they're just not excited about creating content in that way. What advice do you have for those people?
Yeah. So I think that this, again, comes back to a little bit of like what your goals are. Like, I think if you don't want to be a content creator, that's not your business, you're not just trying to get as big an audience as possible, that the pressure is actually much lower. And the other way that I think about this is, like, this is why I've spent lots of time on social media, on Twitter and LinkedIn, and did Instagram for a while, had a Facebook group a long time ago. Like, I've been on, all the platforms, haven't done TikTok yet. Maybe that will come, but I've actually been pulling away from that. And the part of the reason is, I think the same thing that keeps a lot of people from being excited about social media is it just feels like you're just throwing away time and effort, where it's like you're creating this post that is going to be published, and even if it does well, it's not going to be like a lasting piece of work or anything like that. And so what gets me excited, and I kind of have an internal rule for myself, is like, I don't create things generally anymore that are not going to be useful a year from now. And so part of my selection process for the things I write about or the content I create is like, is this going to be something that I can reference in the future that adds to my body of work that makes everything more valuable? And I think that when you approach it that way, it lowers the pressure on needing to create volume, and it kind of increases your motivation to create something that is going to be, substantial and that you can point people back to in the long term. And so one of the ways that as a business owner that I think about this, if you're doing content marketing for your business, is really thinking about targeted people. And so a lot of times, like some of the clients that I work with, like they have pretty high ticket clients. They don't need a lot of people to sign up to work with them for their business to be, functional and
high
successful.
ticket meaning they spend a lot of money or they charge a lot of money for a course or
I would like at least. Yeah, probably at least $1,000, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars. And,
Okay.
This is not every business. But I often recommend to them, like, you should be creating podcast episodes or blog posts, like with one person in mind. And so like, there's somebody who might be, maybe you had a sales conversation with that person and they're like, okay, yeah, this sounds really good. Like, we're going to come back to you on this. It's like, okay, what does that person need to hear right now that would get them excited to sign up? Like, let's create a podcast episode around that topic. And so maybe, they have some hold up. There's some kind of seed of doubt in their mind. It's like, how do we overcome that? Like, let's create that piece of content. And I bet we're going to encounter this situation again, where now we've got that content that next time we have a sales call with somebody, we can say, hey, actually, and check out this podcast episode. I think this is going to be really helpful for where you're at. And so thinking about like current problems that you might be having at some point aspect of your marketing and or kind of like sales, but also thinking about like what's going to come up again in the future that now I've got a resource for that. And so I like to think about it as like building out your kind of like business marketing sales toolkit, kind of where like you've got all these things that you can prescribe to people who you're talking with. And so next time somebody comes to you and, let's take your example. Somebody's looking like, okay, I really want to travel, but I'm having a hard time getting started here and I don't know what skills I have. And it's like, oh, well, you should listen to this episode with so-and-so where they talk through how they did an audit of their skills and they were able to, identify like, oh, these are going to be the most likely that I can actually take this and build a business around it and start traveling. And it's like, you put the work in at one point that now you have this resource that you can always refer people back to in the future. And I think that for me, that's the hugely motivating side of things for getting excited about creating content, where I'm like, hey, every day that I create something or every week that I create something, my overall body of work is getting more valuable rather than just like spending hours creating a post that then gets, sucked in by LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever and never seen again.
Yeah. For podcasts specifically, it's nice when people discover an episode and it engages them, and then they can look back in the feed and they can see, oh, well, there's all these other episodes that are addressing things that they're interested in, and that's bringing people in, allowing them to stick around. And like you said, you can only do that by creating high quality content in that way. I mean, you can almost call it like, when you were chatting about that, I was thinking it's like FAQ content, it's like frequently asked questions, and then answering objections, essentially. Like, what are the big pain points and how can we address them in a piece of content? I love that. I know you're not like totally poo-pooing. Yes, I use the word poo-pooing social media, but since you brought it up, as we go into the coming year, I mean, do you think that people should have some kind of social media strategy, or it's not? I mean, again, these are very overarching and very individual to each person, but social media in general, like let's say the person listening right now, they're kind of like, they're going to hear this podcast, they're going to get inspired, they're going to be like, all right, cool, I'm changing my content strategy. I'm going into the new year. Jeremy kind of mentioned these things. I'm going to jump into this camp. We're going to talk about more stuff as this episode goes on. All right. Social media. Should I ignore it? Should I dive into it?
Yeah. I think it's a personal decision. I think that you need to have, like, if you are going to grow a business of any kind, like, you need to have some way that people discover you. And so social media is obviously one of those ways that there are algorithms that like a large amount of people could potentially discover you. That said, I think if you are going to rely on social media, you need to understand like what you're signing up for. And it's like, you don't necessarily get to create what you want to create. You have to create what the algorithm is going to reward. And so this is something, it's like, if you want to play that game, that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with that. And like, I've certainly done that for times, and it's been beneficial, and it can also be exhausting. And so I tend to go in waves where I'll like get myself around and be like, okay, I have a vision for like how I can do this in a way that aligns with what the algorithm wants and also aligns with what I feel like creating right now. But I know there's other times when I'm just like, I have no energy to create this stuff. I just can't do it. And so I'm like, okay, I'm just not doing social media for now. And I'm going to look at maybe some other kind of exposure channels, and maybe doing, podcast guesting like this, or collaborations with other creators where we're doing kind of like newsletter swaps and shout outs and things like that. And there's times I've done paid advertising as well, and I'm looking to do more of that in the next year as well. And so like those are things where it's like, oh, sometimes I have like a bit of budget that I can put to that, and I'm going to say, hey, let's experiment with this and see if I can make this work. And other times it's like, okay, I don't have the budget right now. Let's look at something else. And so I think understanding you need some way to just for people to discover you is important. Social media is one way to do that, but you need to like play within the bounds. And I think the other thing that social media kind of opens the door to this here is like, social media and any content is much easier to attract people to when you have a kind of overarching premise to your work. And so I think a lot of times people talk about your niche, which is much more like audience and topic focused. And I think a premise, or a like in podcasting terms, I'll call it like the show concept a lot of times, is the unique way in which you explore that topic. And so there's this show, I just discovered it yesterday, actually. It's called Good One. And so it's a podcast about jokes, essentially, and comedy. And so there are many podcasts about comedy. And we can think about even like Netflix shows like Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, things like that. There's been this kind of whole wave of shows talking to comedians, not necessarily comedians just doing their sets, but they're just like conversations with comedians and exploring the more theoretical almost world of comedy. And so Good One is a show about comedy, which is not necessarily interesting. Even if they get great guests on, it's hard to get somebody into that show, because I can hear Jerry Seinfeld be interviewed anywhere. Why would I hear him interviewed on this show? And so like there still isn't a great hook to it. And so the premise of the show, what they added on, is that essentially in every episode, they invite a comedian on and they break down one joke. And so they work through the bit, and then they dissect it and analyze it. And now, like, that's a great hook. This is a great premise that goes beyond just a podcast about comedy. It's a podcast that explores comedy in a very specific way by looking at one joke and then dissecting it and breaking it apart and saying like, okay, here's how I decided on this intro. And here's all these things I tried that didn't work before this. And here's actually why I think this joke works. And here's this. So you get into all this much bigger conversation about comedy and life in general. Yeah. And it's the interesting thing is like, the host, I suspect, so it's a podcast that's currently on I think Vulture is the publication that publishes it. Although my sense in listening through the back catalog is it's actually been a part of different kind of organizations, and it may have just been started by the host on his own. He seems like more of a writer. Like he's a bit stumbly in his speaking and isn't like the world's greatest podcast host. But the fact that the premise is so great, kind of that doesn't matter as much. And I think on a strict interview show, and so we're going deep into podcasting right here because it's what I see a lot. Interview shows are the most common kind of show that people start, but they're the hardest to do well because people have no reason to come to hear your opinions on the topic. And so unless you're famous already. And so it's like, everybody wants to hear from Conan. We want to hear Conan interview somebody because we know Conan. We've heard him interview people before, but somebody off the street who has no reputation as a great interviewer or thinker or anything, we don't really care about that interview show, even if the guests are great, because we can hear great guests anywhere. And if the guests are average everyday people, then we're like, well, I don't know the host, I don't know the guest, like, what am I coming here for? And that's where the premise comes in, where it can be regardless of who the host is, regardless of who the guests are. It's like there's still this hook that is like, oh, I don't care who we're talking to. If I want to hear like a joke get broken down, it's like, yeah, that's interesting to me if I'm interested in comedy in general or storytelling or writing or things like that. And so I think for social media, you see a lot of people who will have a more defined premise around the types of things they post on social media. It all falls in this kind of like framework of or a way of exploring their topic that is unique to them. And it also exists in podcasting and newsletters and YouTube channels. And I think that this is a hugely accelerating trend in content as a whole, where it's just becoming a necessity that just having a topic or a niche is not really enough anymore.
I was just having PTSD from my beginning my podcast and thinking all of those things you said was where my massive imposter syndrome was coming from. When I started this, like, why would I'm not some TV personality who's interviewed people and, all these questions. And those can be things that prevent you. And I'm pulling this up because that was, a part of my own personal journey that I had to overcome in terms of because there is something to just doing it anyway, but you said that can be overcome with the premise and sort of the hook and the value you're providing. And that was always the intention here with this show, because when it started, not to get too meta and dissect this podcast, but there was no business idea around it. There was no I'm going to turn this podcast into my full-time job. It was just I want to share all of these stories that I heard traveling and all the different ways people can travel. Some personal experience stuff's just going to naturally come out, but why don't I talk to all these people that have had all these crazy experiences? Because I'd love to hear them, and what a privilege it is to share them. And this is the stuff that I wish I knew when I was starting out. So I'm like a scratch your own itch kind of entrepreneur. I'm like, I want to create the thing that I wish I had when I was $20,000 in debt and didn't know how to see I just wanted to see the world, but it just felt like some faraway dream that could never actually happen. Let me talk to people who have done it and give that to people. That is empowering, because you don't have to be, like you said, Conan O'Brien or whoever. And, I was mentioning this recently because, we don't think about music as content creation or whatever, but there's this kind of same principle applies. I remember reading, this always stuck with me because did I read or listen to? I guess I listened to Bruce Springsteen's autobiography, Born to Run. And I remember he had a part where he was talking about he didn't feel he had a good voice. And, I think what he meant by that, he's Bruce Springsteen, so I think he's got a pretty great voice. But, for him, I think what he meant is he doesn't have range like Celine Dion or somebody. He's not a trained vocalist who can hit all these crazy notes. And so his way to make up for that, he's well, then I just have to write the best lyrics out there. I have to write the best story. I have to create the best characters. I have to it has to be so good that it overcomes my voice limitations, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what you're saying in a way. Yeah.
I wrote a newsletter about this a little while ago where I had kind of come up with all these examples, and I was a little bit curious about this, but you hear the same story again and again and again and again with so many world-class performers and creators and whatever artists, where so much of what makes their work distinctive and unique is them compensating for some perceived lack. And so it exists in sports, it exists in artistry. I one of the ones that I came up with and discovered is that Lionel Messi, he basically had this growth hormone imbalance as a kid, which stunted his growth. And so he knew he had to develop ball skills unlike anybody else, because he was the smaller, he couldn't compete on size. And so he became this phenomenal kind of ball control soccer player. And it just shows up again and again. You hear these stories, and I think that that's something that we often we want to be like other people. We have our idol who are I want to be like that, so I'm going to work on the skills to try and be like that, when often we can't. That person, somebody has something that's spiky about them that is there's not going to be another Mariah Carey. Nobody's going to sing like Mariah Carey. And I bring this up because Kelly just loves Mariah Carey and is idolizes her, and she had this
and she's an opera. She was an opera singer, so she knows what she's talking about. Yeah.
And she realized at some point I will never be like that. And so there's these other things where it's sometimes when we try to chase that thing of the people we want to be we actually limit our own growth. And I think there's something worth aspiring towards being like somebody else and following them as an example. But I think at some point you have to realize well, I can't be the next them, and that wouldn't even be interesting, because if that's what I'm trying to do, people would just if I want Mariah Carey music, I'm just going to listen to Mariah Carey. I'm not going to go for the cover band who's singing Mariah Carey covers. And so I think that it's looking at some point for okay, what are the things that either I feel I have to compensate for, or are some of my weaknesses that I'm working around? And what if I actually emphasized those and made that a bigger part of my work, and really drew attention to them in some way, or really doubled down on those? And I think that that's often a really interesting way to develop more distinctive work. I think Claude Monet was another one where he actually had some kind of eyesight issue that led to all of his impressionistic work. And there's like just examples throughout history of these things that of people who create something original and distinctive is actually because they couldn't do it like the right way.
It's a very important point. Thank you for sharing this, because I think that, we're not saying this is a trend. This is like an all-time trend, right? Like embracing your limitations and kind of that idea of just being okay with working with what you have right now in the moment. That's all any of us can do. And this is something I wanted to bring up because I wanted to get your advice on the process of finding your voice. And by that, doesn't, podcasting, it's your actual voice in many ways. It's also the voice of the show in any type of content creation or whatever you're putting out there, newsletter, whatever. You can emulate certain people. You can use that for inspiration, but ultimately you're going to kind of settle into finding your voice. And this kind of ties in with all of that, I think, because if you're going into the next year and you're thinking, some of the stuff we're talking about is stuff that you're going to be implementing or you're implementing now, and you maybe want to change or tweak. It's just another kind of consideration of how you put yourself out there. Like, is this, for me, it has to just feel, I think with podcasting, there's an advantage because you can't really hide who you are necessarily behind hours and hours of audio and conversations and everything. And you shouldn't hide who you are. I think that's a part of the authenticity. And maybe that's a word that we should talk about. Is that a buzzword? Is that like an overused word? Along those lines, and with the idea of sort of finding your voice, what advice do you have for people for that whole process from a mindset perspective, and even any practical stuff you have to share?
Yeah. So there's a couple things that I would say related to that. I think the first is that you should expect that it will take a long time. I think we have unrealistic expectations around finding your voice. I feel, so back in 2020, this is basically the thing that total kind of turning point in my life and business was when I started writing every day. So January 1st, 2020, I inspired mainly by Seth Godin, but also by many other people. I'd heard probably a dozen people at that point just say that writing every day was this transformative thing that totally changed their life. And I was like, okay, I've heard enough people say this. I've never heard anybody say the opposite. So let's give it a go. And so I committed 1 hour every morning. First thing I did, I wrote and I published. And so it wasn't just writing every day, it was actually publishing something every day. And I set myself a hard hour limit, and nobody read anything. Basically, I published on Medium. There was a couple posts that got a couple hundred views. Most of them got 2 or 3. And so I did that for 6 months, and basically no audience, but it developed a huge amount of confidence in. So I was already working as a kind of podcast consultant and producer at that point, but I always had this kind of fear around, a client getting on a call. And I always kind of put my clients on a pedestal, thinking they were way smarter than me because they had all these much bigger businesses and they knew what they were doing and I didn't. And I was always worried that I was going to get caught. And I'd been doing this for 4 or 5 years already at this point, this business. And I was just waiting for the day where they would ask a question on a consulting call and I'd be like, I don't know, even though that had never happened yet in all this time, but I was worried about it. And then basically through, 6 months, hundreds of blog posts of writing, I basically realized I don't have all the answers, but my thinking has become very structured, where any question came up and be like, oh yeah, I've written about that. I know how to articulate this and go through this. And so part of it was that was a big turning point for me in terms of my confidence as a business owner and creator and marketer, but and as a person as well. But also my voice emerged over that time slowly. And so that's hundreds of posts at this point. And so now I've been writing, what are we in 2024 now? So mostly every day for coming up on 5 years. And I would say that it was 2 years into that where I was oh, things are really clicking. And so I think it's I don't want to say that it's not you need to dig through all that kind of initial stuff to find your voice. And it's not any of that early stuff is not worth it. I think sometimes it's well, we just want to skip to the point where we have our voice, and it's do we have to put up with 2 years of stuff that's basically just wasted time? And it's no, a lot of that stuff, I didn't feel I had my voice, but it was actually working for my business in many other ways. I basically wrote out my whole original course curriculum through that daily writing practice, which then became a course, which now became a full business. And so I look back on it, I'm like, that's not really my voice now, but it was still worthwhile and effective. And it helped me. It was help useful. Grow my audience over time. It was useful. Yeah. It just didn't feel like, now I feel like I'm like, oh, I now have a distinctive voice that people comment on and they reference and they notice. But like, I could still create useful content outside of that. But it's like, now everything works much better. And now I know like, what is a essay of mine? And sometimes I'll like look back at old newsletters. Somebody will email me about something that they read on the blog or whatever, and I'll like reread it and I'll be like, wow, that was a great ending. Like I just nailed that ending line. And it feels like, I'm like, yeah, that was one of mine. And I think that that is something that comes with time. But also the other thing that I've noticed, and I heard this quote about finding your voice that is the most true thing I feel like that I've heard, which was that basically the quote was something like, it's not, the thing about finding your voice is that it's not about finding it, it's about releasing the handbrake. And I was like, that actually feels right, because I think we often create in a way that we think we're supposed to, when really it's like, it's often we're censoring ourselves in some way, and not censoring in a content perspective. I mean, sometimes we are, but also in a like emotionality perspective or a personality perspective. And one of the things that like I now do whenever I am really, and I'll give you a couple of practical things when it comes to finding your voice. The first is that I have assembled like a list of people whose voice I like and who are my influences. And so I just like have that list it's online in my kind of personal Notion document where I can like go and look. I'm like, okay, these are the people who I just like love their voice. And so if I want to feel inspired or whatever, or if I just think about like a topic at this point, I don't really need to think actively about it. But when I was really more working on that side of things, I would read a lot of their work and I would just be like, oh yeah, I wish I could sound like this, or and I like these aspects of this. And I would actually write down, it's like, okay, what do I like about Seth Godin? I like his brevity. I like the way he uses stories and can kind of give you this aha moment that you didn't see coming. There's another brand that I like called the Do Lectures, the writer or the founder and writer, David Hyatt. I love his copywriting, sales, email copywriting. And so I would like break down, like, what do I like about it? Why does it work on me? And how can I incorporate that? And there's all these things. It's like you study the people that you like and you're like, oh, this is what I like. And you start to uncover these elements that you're like, oh, these things, if I really resonate with them, probably those are already a part of me. Those things are speaking to some part of me that I should bring out and emphasize. And maybe I don't have the muscle to know how to do that yet because I've never thought about it. But like one of the things with the Do Lectures, there's two companies that David Hyatt runs. The Do Lectures is kind of like an online education and conference company. And then he also runs another company called Hyatt Denim, which is a jeans company. They're both based in tiny town in West Wales. He lives out on this farm in like, the rural Wales near the coast. And they have in both brands, there's a huge sense of place, which shouldn't really matter per se for companies that have global audiences. But I like that he comments on like the weather, like, rainy day today in West Wales, like it just in like the sign off or something like that. And I was always like, oh, I really like that, because that's something that I have this, unsurprisingly being somebody who's traveled a lot and who like has this yearning for, exploring the world. Like I was always like, yeah, that's a part of me. And so I started working that more into my content and like feeling like, oh, a sense of place is kind of like it doesn't make sense for podcasting related, but it's something distinctive. It makes you go like, huh, interesting. But like, what is that when I share those types of things? And then people will comment and like, oh, so you're in Barcelona. Yeah. And they'll comment on different things of like, oh, I heard you were saying like the weather's like this or whatever, or like, and I just like put those things in because I've noticed that I resonated. It made me like the brand more because it had it. And I thought, oh, that means that that's a part of me. And so I think the first thing is just like noticing. I always think about this of like, we're talking about finding your voice, but I think there's this idea of finding yourself. And I think that there's this really interesting angle of that something I found is like when I visit certain places, and this is, I think, this is a great audience for this with travelers. There's some places that I think everybody's experienced this who is a traveler where it feels like home somehow. There's something that you feel just like the strong resonance of like, oh, this feels like a part of me in some way. And I think that it's worth noting those things. I always think about that as like, that's what it means to find yourself, is you have this experience with some piece of content or art or a place or whatever it is that resonates strongly with you, and thinking like, oh, what is it about that this thing that is like a part of me, and how do I bring that into my work, even in a kind of abstract way. And so like another example is, I always feel, going back to like this is actually one of the strange things like about Wales and like the UK and Ireland. Like I've always felt a strong resonance with like the rocky kind of cliffs and coasts, specifically of that region. And it's not like, I kind of felt that a little bit with like where I was from in Vancouver and BC, but it's way more, it's like a UK Ireland type thing, strangely, where I just like, there's something about it that just like fills me up. And so I started using like imagery a lot of times that was like, stock photos and stuff from Unsplash that it doesn't make any, there's no real connection to my podcasting work, but I was like, this is something that's a part of me. I'm going to incorporate this into some of my work. And so I think finding those things, using them as kind of beacons for like, oh, there's something here that is part of me and my voice, and bringing that and channeling that is a useful thing. And then on that note, the second thing is whenever I really, we both have backgrounds in music. For me, the other kind of part of this with music in particular, like I always feel like my biggest dream was to become a rock star. And like, that's still like the thing that if I think about creatively, the thing that would be most fulfilling, it would be like playing in front of audiences every night, basically. And doing the whole like touring the world. No, it's not like maybe the easiest lifestyle as you move into your 30s and 40s and beyond, but it's like that was the dream always. And so there's always like these songs where I just felt like, oh, this feels like it's saying the thing that I wish I could say, but I could never write that lyric or write that song. And so I have a playlist of all the stuff that feels like just like speaks to the core of me. And it's like I put on that playlist every time I'm like writing something that I really like want to channel what I see as my voice. And so looking at some of these things and like having these external things that you can refer to and say, oh, this feels like my voice. How do I bring that into my work? And so that's what's worked for me, and might be worth trying for other people as well.
Wow. Tons of great advice in there. And I think also the practical stuff you mentioned of just pulling that out of the idea of, diving in and committing to like a daily practice around something that you're kind of searching for, your format or your voice or whatever you want to call it. And then using the various, and you could almost call it like your virtual vision board, like the playlist or the artists, the writers, the people that inspire you, and kind of like feeding that into your brain. There's a lot of mindset stuff there and practical stuff. So I really appreciate you sharing that. By the way, will you share that playlist with me? I want to hear it. I want to get inside your brain musically.
All right.
Now we're going to take a quick break from the interview to talk road tripping. Now, our friends at Defender love a great road trip, and I want to thank them for supporting this special 5-part series. It's our road trip planning guide mini-series. It's packed with road trip inspiration and advice. It's all going to lead up to the final segment in the series where you're going to plan an epic road trip of your own, so you have something locked in that you are excited about for the coming year. And keep an open mind, because you might even end up somewhere completely unexpected next year than what you're thinking now. Who knows? Anyway, this week, you're getting part 2 of this 5-part series, Dare to Dream. I'm going to share 3 outstanding overland road trips. We're going to highlight 3 amazing, iconic road trips to give you some trip inspiration. You see what I did there. Anyway, pay attention, because I put these in a particular order for a reason. And I'm going to share at the end of this short segment why they're in this order, because I want you to do the same thing when you're done listening. Again, this is part of working up to that final segment where you're going to plan your own iconic road trip, whatever that means to you. Speaking of iconic, speaking of adventure, I do want to say a massive thank you to the icon of adventure, Defender, for supporting this special mini-series. Defender is truly the ultimate road trip vehicle for many reasons, including its durability, its cargo capacity, and the fact that it's tested to the extreme. Defender's family of vehicles include the 90, 110, or 130, which has 8 seats. Defender is an icon of adventure with a tough, rigid body design, and it has been reimagined for a new generation of explorers. That is you. Design your Defender at LandRoverUSA.com. Okay, we're diving in Dare to dream. 3 outstanding overland trips. And I'm sharing these 3 with you today, again, in a particular order, which will all be clear in a minute. And I'm going to start with the first road trip. This is the world's longest drivable road, according to wikioverland.org. And that is the Pan American Highway. It's around 30,000 kilometers, 19,000 miles in total length. It runs from Prudhoe Bay, Alaska to Ushuaia, Argentina. Of course, there is a bit of an interruption there between Panama and Colombia. There's a 66-mile stretch known as the Darien Gap. You might have heard of it. You can ship your vehicle over that. And this is a trip I'd love to do someday. I mean, you're going to pass through some incredible places, starting in Alaska, running through Canada, down on the west coast. You get to Central America. You're going to go through places like Mexico and Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and on, hitting eventually South America, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Argentina. You can do side trips. I mean, endless adventures, endless things to see. And I mean, what an incredible, epic road trip. And I'm going to link up to this resource. It is wikioverland.org/pan_American_highway. And that gives you the breakdown on some of the logistics and all of those fun questions. And if you really want to dive in and think about doing this adventure one day in the future on your own, or with a friend, or with your partner, whoever, then you should definitely check out this resource to go a little deeper. This is the ultimate road trip through North and Central and South America. And I thought about putting in the ultimate road trip in Africa, Cape Town to Cairo. That is another iconic road trip. 6,200 miles, completely unpredictable journey. All these journeys are unpredictable, and that's what makes it such an adventure. That's what makes it fun. But I went with the Pan American Highway just because it's something that I've thought about for a long time. This is my own personal list. You're going to make yours next. But again, wanted to give you some inspiration, some advice, and get you excited about what you're going to be planning. Okay. The second one I'm going to share. When you think about the USA, what do you think about in terms of road trips? I think many people might go to arguably the most famous drive in America, Route 66, a.k.a. the Mother Road, a.k.a. Main Street of America. It was popularized by the U.S. 66 Highway Association, actually, which marketed it as, quote, the shortest, best, and most scenic route from Chicago to Los Angeles for a total of 2,448 miles. It actually ends in Santa Monica, and it was further popularized by American pop culture. When people think about road trips in America, Route 66 is probably the first one that comes to mind. And you could do a small part of it even, or you could do the whole thing. I loved my time out west on Route 66. I mean, the scenery, the small towns, you got the mom and pop shops, plenty of things to see and do, including historic sites. According to NPS.gov, which is the National Park Service, quote, the National Register of Historic Places is the official list of the nation's historic places worthy of preservation. To date, more than 250 Route 66 buildings, districts, and road segments are listed on the National Register. So if you enjoy pit stops, this is loaded with them. And again, you can think about chunking this out or doing a small part. I would recommend somewhere out on the West Coast. Just so beautiful. But you could also do the whole thing. I mean, why not? Why not? Okay. The last one. Okay, I'm getting a little selfish here, but there's a reason for that. So you can stick around again as I close this out, and let me tell you why, because I'm going to have you do this same exercise and list out 3 road trips in a minute. Nordkap. The Nordkap is the northernmost point of continental Europe that can be reached by a vehicle. And I live in Norway. I live in Oslo, Norway. So for me, this is maybe perhaps more doable than for you. It's just under 2,000 kilometers on one route from here, about 25 hours driving. Plenty of incredible nature and opportunities for getting out into nature along the way. You can sleep in charming towns, sleep in these colorful fishing villages. Of course, Then you arrive at the Nordkap, and that's an experience in and of itself. If it's the winter, you can live your days without any sun. You can experience those polar nights and the northern lights, or the midnight sun in the summer where the sun never goes down. You got the wild cliffs and the oceans, the unforgettable hiking trails. I mean, I could go on, but I'm not going to, because the title of this segment was Dare to Dream. 3 incredible, outstanding overland trips. And now it's your turn to dare to dream. And what I did here for myself, and what I want you to do coming out of the segment, is make your own list and rank them. So the first one would be a huge travel dream, maybe your ultimate road dream trip, something that is perhaps super epic, whatever that means to you. And if you only had one road trip left, this might be the one to put on there. Okay. The second one can be a stretch goal road trip, something that you might be a little tough to pull off in the near future for whatever reason, but it could be possible if you prioritize it. And the third, something that's fairly easy and accessible that you could perhaps lock in for the coming year. Driving to the Nordkap isn't necessarily easy, but for me, being based in Norway, it is something I could do. It's accessible. And again, these are really massive trips, right? I mean, you don't have to have your list be, a 2,000 mile road trip, a 30,000 kilometer, 19,000 mile road trip, a 6,000 plus mile road trip. It can be smaller in scale. That's totally cool. But this is just getting you to grease the wheels of the actual dream turning to a reality. And this is why I said going into the segment, you might end up somewhere unexpected as we go along in the coming weeks and continue this road trip planning guide mini series. You're already off and running for your planning. Okay, there you go. Be on the lookout for the next bonus segment. And I want to share one last thank you to the icon of adventure, Defender, for helping me help you plan your next iconic adventure, for making this miniseries possible. Defender has been reimagined through thoroughly modern design, but one thing that hasn't changed is Defender's legendary capability, off-road and on. It's the ultimate vehicle for road tripping. You can explore the Defender 90, 110, and 130, which has 8 seats, over at LandRoverUSA.com. Thanks for listening. This is a little tangent, but we're allowed to do that because this is the Zero to Travel podcast. We're allowed to talk about travel, of course. The other places that make you feel like home. You mentioned those places that make you feel like home. And UK, Ireland, so the Rocky Coast Cliff thing. You guys have been all over the place. Where else have you gotten that feeling?
Yeah, I feel like that's really the strongest one. I remember the first time that I went to Seville in Spain, first trip to Spain. I think that was, yeah. I just immediately felt like, oh, I could live here. And the funny thing is I've been back now at least another time or twice and didn't feel that anymore. The interesting thing is I feel like a lot of times the first time that I've been to a place has been this ooh, this place is perfect, or I could be here. And you realize as we've slowed down our travel, some places you realize, oh, that feeling lasts for a week. There's about a week of interesting in this place, which is great. But if you stay there 6 months or 3 months or whatever, it becomes kind of boring. So that it has been an interesting lesson in going from spending 3 to 5 days in a place to spending 1 to 3 months in a place, sometimes longer. I would say, specifically within the UK, Edinburgh, we got locked down. We spent 6 months there in COVID, and just one of my favorite places in the world. I just love everything about it. And Scotland as a whole, but Edinburgh in particular. I also mentioned last time we were doing the podcast, Belgrade was a surprising one where I don't really know, if somebody was asking, why would I go to Belgrade? What would you do there? I would have zero answer. I was like, I don't know. I know it's known for clubbing and parties, which is not something that I'm into at all. But I think that's what people go there for. But I just loved it. There was a vibe. There was something about it that we just had such a great time there that I have really, really fond memories and just kind of constantly want to go back to. I also feel Prague, I feel a lot of that for. And where else am I thinking of here? I feel like the Balkans in general, in a weird way, like we've probably spent a cumulative 2 years in the Balkans, only ever for like 3 to 6 months at a time. But there's something about it that I just love. The culture is like, not like something we're familiar to. And obviously, like we don't speak any of the languages there in any of the countries that we've been to. And so you're not really building local community, but there's something just really unpretentious that I really like. It just feels like, I don't know, you just like get an honest view of the place that isn't always true in some other places. And so, yeah, I really love those parts of the world as well.
I love that about your nomad journey. It feels like you guys just kind of almost, I don't know if you chose all these places on a whim, but it's like, it's not like you're going to these digital nomad hotspots where it's just all sort of expat digital nomads or, trying to sort of figure this stuff. I mean, you just seem like you've gone to a lot of places just for the sheer curiosity of, let's see what this is like. Okay, this is affordable. I mean, how did you choose the places to spend quality time in? You have any advice around that for the current or budding nomads that are like, oh yeah, I like this slow travel idea. 8 years? I don't know, but
Yep. Yeah, ours has been interesting because at least 3 of those 8 years have been bordering COVID in some way. And so in COVID, it was very much kind of driven by this, like, where could we go? And so we got locked down in Scotland when things and everything shut down initially. And then, so I'm Canadian, Kelly's American. Americans were not really, because of the way the pandemic was handled, we're not really welcome most places in the world. And so it was kind of like, where can Kelly get into? And we kind of had a loophole because we weren't flying from the US. A lot of times that was what was restricted, is they weren't accepting flights from the US. But because we had not been in the US, we were able to get into Portugal was next. And so we were in Lisbon, and there was like no tourists there for 3 months, which was amazing. We've been back since, now that tourism's opened up again, and it's kind of just wild. And then after that, it was basically much of Europe was shut down to travel. And so then the Balkans were quite open. And so we headed there. And that was interesting because a lot of the culture in the Balkans was very like, kind of like COVID denial, like, oh no, it's not a real thing. We don't have COVID here. It like doesn't exist, and like no masks, and like very much open. And so we kind of secluded ourselves quite a bit, but we could travel within those countries. And so that was kind of drove a lot of that. And I'd actually I traveled through the Balkans previously and loved it the first time, years before. And so was really happy to go back. And then we've actually been back again since that. But that was kind of part of it, was just where could we go. And then earlier, it was always just kind of a like, what are we curious about right now? And there was some, especially in the earlier years, cost played a way bigger factor. And so we spent a bunch of time in Central and South America where it was more affordable than Europe. But I would say generally it was like, sometimes there would be friends in a place. Sometimes there might have been like a conference or something we would go to and then stick around. But mostly it was just kind of like looking at the map and being like, okay, what are we curious about right now in terms of like timeline, like where we, maybe we have to be somewhere in a certain amount of time, like where do we go in between? And then also very kind of like, once you got to a place, a lot of times we'd only plan out like a month or two in the future. And so we'd know, okay, we're going to be here for, 2 months. And then after that, like what's kind of local around there? It doesn't necessarily mean neighboring countries, but within the region where we're not like flying across the ocean or, whatever, to kind of go from there. So yeah, I would say very kind of this mix of curiosity driven, and then having some kind of anchor, either person or event or something. And then just pure logistical, who will let us in at this point.
Yeah. This is one of those podcasts where COVID comes up more than other ones in a sense, because it's so much a part of people's travel journeys. Because a lot of guests have been, they were out traveling the world, and they got, either stuck in places or had to go somewhere to find a place to stay. And that's just the nature of nomadic life. And that was an unpredictable time for sure. Why are you guys settling down in Spain? I don't mean like Spain specifically, but just were you burnt out, or did you just kind of get tired of schlepping your stuff around, or just kind of ready to just chill out in one place?
Yeah, probably a little bit of all of those. I had actually, before Kelly and I met up in person, I was had personally been like, okay, I think this is my last trip. And so I'd been traveling 2.5 years solo at that point, and it was just like feeling the lack of community and friends and things like that. And then meeting up with Kelly, that kind of rejuvenated it, where it was a totally different experience when you're traveling with somebody who is also like, I traveled with friends at some points, but there was always, and she had done as well, and it was the same, we both had the same experience, where when you're traveling with friends who aren't working for themselves, there's kind of always this kind of like, when are you going to be done work today so we can go do this thing? It's like, I mean, I'm working a full day. Like
Right.
I work for myself, but it's a job still. Like I still need to do all these things. And so that, it's not quite the same experience. Whereas then when you start traveling with somebody who, I mean, in our case, became a long-term, consistent, obviously like romantic relationship, but also just like if it was a friend, I think it would have been done the same thing for me, where it's like you have somebody who gets what you're doing, is not going to be asking, when are you done? It's more like, hey, when should we go get dinner tonight or whatever. But having that person who like understands your context and you're just like both doing the same thing, that kind of rejuvenated things. And so then we kept traveling for a long time. Then actually right before COVID, 2019 was going to be our last trip. And then we were going to settle in Canada after that. And then we ended up getting stuck in Europe for 2 years, basically. And over that time, we started thinking about, like, we were going to do either Canada or the US because, we're each from those countries. We thought, well, that's going to be easiest to get a visa. And then we actually started questioning during COVID, like, well, if one of us has to apply for residency, like, what might happen if we considered, like, what if we both said, like, okay, maybe we both go through the paperwork. And then we started looking at, like, okay, in Europe, like, what's possible. And there was a few countries at the time that did have visa options for nomads. I think Portugal had one, Croatia had one, and there's a couple others here and there. And so we started looking into that. And then we kind of started this like couple of years long of like scouting. So first we were going to move to Lisbon, or to Portugal, I should say. And so but Lisbon was kind of our first kind of thought where we'd go. And so we like went to Lisbon to kind of like scope it out post-COVID, see like, okay, what kind of neighborhood, if we were to go through the process. Then we were kind of like just not quite feeling it. And the next kind of stop was Berlin, where we were looking at a visa there. So we went there for a bit and like scoped that out. And then that wasn't going to work out for other kind of like job related reasons. And then Spain opened up their visa in the past kind of year and a half. And it was like, oh, that's interesting. And kind of it was almost like the stars kind of aligned in a way where we were like, oh, we really feel a lot better about Spain than some of the other countries. We'd rather learn Spanish as a second language. The visa was like perfectly designed for us, which wasn't the case in Germany. There's obviously like probably everybody's heard about like some of the anti-tourism stuff in Barcelona in particular, where we are. But we were kind of concerned about that on Lisbon, where when we had been there, there was a tension that was palpable of like, it's such a small country and a small city that the influx of people is clearly disrupting things. And we were kind of like, Spain is a vastly bigger country geographically and population wise, that it feels like us moving there has less of an impact on local real estate and culture and all those things. And so we were kind of more, felt better about it in general. And so it's kind of like all these things kind of just like lined up and we were like, oh, this feels like a better solution.
Yeah, great. I mean, of course, visas can drive a lot of these decisions. That's a practical thing. And I think it's, of course, another trend coming in, these digital nomad visas. And we have a whole episode on those that was published earlier this month. So people can check that out if they want to go deep into getting a jump on what types of visas to get in the coming year, some of the new ones. And there's some exciting stuff happening. If you're looking to live abroad or spend extended time abroad, there are a lot of options. Granted, that's like, if you have the right passport and all these sort of things, which is, got to acknowledge the privilege there. But what about trends in remote work? Because you've been working remotely so long, I imagine you guys have been hitting up a lot of co-working spaces. You've been, I'm sure, around some other remote workers here and there. I don't know if you have anything to share. I know this wasn't really a part of the core topic, but it is a lifestyle component, right? Like when you're traveling, you're working remotely. Have you noticed anything like around that space, or like maybe co-working spaces themselves, like how they've changed? Anything to share around that?
Yeah, we've we've been in and out of co-working spaces. I generally work from home now. And this is one of the challenges for me was always like being in podcasting. When I've had podcasts, it's impossible to do at co-working spaces. Although now there are many more that are opening up. Like as podcasting has taken off, there are more like podcast recording booths and kind of like video production, like little mini studios that are available for rent. Sometimes those are in co-working spaces. Actually, my friend in London just told me that in the there's the beer brand Brewdog, people might know, and that they in their like one of their breweries, they have a podcast recording booth now in studio, which I was like, that's
cool.
a interesting kind of little take. I like that. So more of those things are becoming available, which is interesting. And I would also just say co-working spaces in general have become way more prevalent. And like we really struggled in the early years to find stuff in a lot of places. And now, obviously it still depends on where you are, but in most kind of even small to mid-sized cities, there's going to be some options. So it's becoming easier. And then the other thing is like just noticing, I think part of this is just being based in a city like Barcelona where people come to. Like we have had, it's on a monthly basis, we have friends coming in who are spending, anywhere from like a week to a few weeks to a month, and they're like working, while they're here. And so it's very clear that remote work has become a way more kind of common practice.
Okay. What about trends in newsletters? I mean, I think a lot of people see success in Substack, or they see people being successful creating paid newsletters. There are obviously newsletters that are driven by the need to just kind of stay in touch and perhaps sell some things and make a living, which is part of business. You've written a lot of newsletters, as you mentioned. You have a successful one. How should people approach that platform, that content creation in 2025?
Yeah, I think it's the same as going back to that idea with social media of having a premise for the newsletter. I think that makes it so much easier to like the hard thing about, there's potentially multiple hard things about newsletters, especially if you don't see yourself as a writer. Writing the newsletter can be hard. But I think that the hard part is getting people to subscribe to the newsletter in the first place. And, that's why a lot of times people have lead magnets and freebies and things like that to entice people to sign up. But I think there is this trend that's kind of started over the past 2-3 years and is still kind of accelerating, where the newsletter is presented as just a thing you want to get anyway. And so much like, we don't need a lead magnet to start listening to a podcast, because it's like, I want to listen to a podcast. And it's like, I can see the value in that from the outside. And so I think
we should
that's
just clarify what a lead magnet is for people that don't know.
Yeah. So essentially it would be like some kind of like free thing that you offer people in order to get them to sign up to your email list. And so maybe it's like a PDF, or maybe you have like some kind of like, you're going to get this like little 5-day email course or something like that on, how to find your first location independent job or something like that. And it's like, okay, I'll sign up with my email address, and then, I'm going to get this thing. And then I'm also going to get ongoing email communication from whoever created it. So, but with like, YouTube or podcasting, we don't need to entice people to consume that content in that way. But I think historically, email has been something that most of us feel like it's an annoyance. And I think that in the past few years, there's been this kind of either resurgence or kind of this new kind of trend of just valuable emails that are like useful content, interesting content, stuff that you would want to get. You don't need to be bribed in order to sign up for it. And so I think that is, still accelerating. And I think that, again, like having a premise to your newsletter makes it much easier to get people to sign up. And then the other thing that like I would say is, as newsletters have become more popular content, and the good thing is that there's lots of good newsletter content out there. There's also a lot of bad content. I think that actually the length, I think a lot of people I talk to feel like when they're writing a newsletter, it needs to be long, like it needs to be an essay. And I don't think this is true at all. Like one of my favorite newsletters is by a guy named Josh Spector. It's called The Daily Graph, which is, I always thought a bit of a too clever name. It's essentially like the daily paragraph is what he's going at here. It took me like a year to realize like, oh, that's what he's trying to say here. But it's basically like a 2-sentence every issue. I think he sends it out every day. It's just 2 sentences. And he's a really good copywriter. And so it's usually just a link to something interesting that he's found. And I open, not every single one, but probably like 3 out of 5 per week. And it's like, that can't take them that long. Like the work is finding the thing to share and then figuring out how do I phrase this in two or three sentences that make somebody want to click. And I'm, not all of it's relevant to me, but I'm happy enough. Like it's kind of like if we think about a spectrum of like glad you opened the newsletter on one end to like disappointed you opened it and you regret opening it. It's like all we need to do is be like 51%. I think about this as like the minimum viable value. If somebody opens up a newsletter and is like their day is just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit better, then they're going to be glad, like, oh, this shifted their day in a tiny bit towards the positive. And so they're going to stay subscribed and keep opening it. And so it's like, we don't need to, I think, and this is true for most content or all content. I think a lot of times we're like, especially if you're a creative type person, it's like, I want to make the best thing ever. And like everything must be like amazing. And it's actually like, well, actually, it just needs to be better than neutral. And if people consistently have that experience that every time they engage with your content, their life or their day is just a tad better, they're going to keep engaging with that. And I think, occasionally it's great to have some like really amazing stuff that you put out. But most of the time it's like just kind of like, getting on base, kind of, to use a baseball analogy, where it's like not going for the home run. It's just like, hey, let's just like keep getting on base, keep getting hits, just little bits here and there. And I think that that's enough for people. And it doesn't take, a huge essay to do that. You can do that in probably something that takes you, 30 minutes, per week to create for a newsletter, especially if you have the right premise around it.
Yeah, I love that. And to tie that back in with the lifestyle piece, because I talk to a lot of people that are interested in starting podcasts. And one of the things I tell them is, make it work with your lifestyle so it can be sustainable. Don't just assume a piece of content has to be a certain way. Like, oh, like if I'm a YouTuber, I have to do a 30-minute in-depth. It's like, no, you could do like a 2-minute talking head thing. Like it might not work, who knows? But, you have to do the thing that matches with your lifestyle and that will allow you to keep creating the content you want to create. And it has to be sustainable, right? So like if you're starting a podcast, I always tell people like, what does that look like for you? Like, is it a 10-minute thing? Like you don't have to do a long interview show like me. Like I love going deep and having deep, like longer conversations because I personally love it and I love sharing it. But it's, of course, way more time consuming than a 10-minute solo podcast where you're just riffing on a topic or whatever. But I don't care because I love it and I love sharing it. So it has to be aligned with, I think, what you like to do, and also, thinking about it from a meta perspective of how can you structure it in a way that you can keep doing it and doing it consistently, because that is part of content creation, I would say. And some people might look at that as like an exciting part where we get to, go out and have all these, like for me, having these conversations and sharing it. And other people, if it's done in a way where it's not aligned, it can feel like a content hamster wheel.
Yep. Yeah. The other thing that I want to add here that is maybe not a trend I'm seeing yet, but when I'm like trying to promote, and that this is always something that when I talk with my clients is a really bit of a relief, is a lot of content right now and a lot of the ways you're taught to create content is from this perspective of the expert. Like, all the things and you're going to like teach people how to achieve something. But I personally, so almost all of my content creation is driven by an exploratory mindset, which I think, for travelers in particular, people interested in that, like that's probably your natural default setting anyway. It's like you want to go explore the world, you want to explore maybe ideas. And I think that this is a super underrated approach to content creation in general. And I remember that this had me hung up for so long. And in hindsight, it's kind of like shocking where I felt like, well, I need to present information that is objectively true and verifiable, and I have the research to back it up or whatever. And now what I realize is there, in many fields, like there is no truth and nobody knows the answers. And the way that any kind of niche or industry is furthered is by people just going out and exploring stuff. And it's saying, I wonder, I've never heard anybody talk about this before. Like, I wonder if there's something there. And you go out and you either write about it or you create content about it. You do the research and you like then report back on like, hey, I was curious about this thing. And so I like did some research and here's what I found. And, I read this book or read these blog posts. I read this Wikipedia page. And, that's for some people I know some people who love research and like that's something that they can really, go down the rabbit hole and do. I've never been the biggest researchy type person, but for me, it's more about positing based on kind of like, okay, so I've never heard anybody talk about this, but I'm going to like write through my thoughts on it, and we'll see. I'm going to put that out there as a newsletter, and we'll see if that like aligns with what other people are thinking or feeling about it. And a lot of times people come back and like, oh, I never thought about it that way, but that's exactly been my experience as well. And I'm not saying like this is objectively true and I can back it up. It's saying like, I haven't heard, there's no content on this. I wonder if maybe this is how it works. And like putting a thought out there, not as the expert, but as somebody who's just kind of exploring an idea. And over time, you kind of explore further and further and further. I always think about it like in my mind, basically how I think about my work is, I think about it in terms of like a video game. You like get planted in like a space at the start of the game, and you have your little like map in the bottom corner, and it's totally like obscured and grayed out. And like as you wander around the world, the map, like you can see a little bit of like where you've been. I'm thinking like Legend of Zelda here. And now the map, you can kind of go back and look at like where you've explored. And I think about like, oh, that's exactly what I'm doing. That's how I see my work is like, there's this whole world out here, specifically right now in podcasting, but more broadly kind of marketing and content creation. And then you could get into like human psychology and stuff like that. And I'm just like wandering through it and like writing stuff along the way and trying to like build out the map as I go. And I think that for me took a lot of the pressure off of getting started in content creation, saying like, I need to know what I'm talking about, and saying like, I'm just going to go out and like explore the world and then report back on what I'm seeing. And maybe I'm going to be wrong about some stuff, and maybe I'm going to be right. And either way is fine, as it kind of like is a way for me to get smarter for myself and also help other people kind of explore that world along with me.
Yeah, I love that. The exploratory mindset, and just takes a lot of pressure off, and you're allowed to have fun with this stuff, right? I mean, that's the thing. It's not like, especially if imposter syndrome is stopping you, or you're thinking like you do have to be a certain level of expert to share. And, that's just not the case. I mean, everybody's entitled to their opinion. And like you said, if you're doing it in a way where you feel like, the people reading, listening, consuming, whatever, understand that, you're just exploring, you're sharing some perspectives, and you're not claiming to know everything about everything or what's right for them. I mean, that's the key, right? Like, who knows? I don't like to be told what to do. I'd say most people don't. Any other big sort of trends you wanted to cover on this? I know we were talking a little bit beforehand. Maybe we covered this idea of like really just having a point of view and being opinionated, not being afraid to be opinionated about something. I'm not sure if we touched on that to the level that you want, or if there's any other big resources you want to share to stay on top of trends, or like, anything else that's like, is there a gaping hole here we need to fill?
I do think that the point of view thing is important. I think that there is like so much information available today, and anybody can go to ChatGPT or whatever your AI tool of choice is, or to Google, and you can get like very bland, depersonalized information that I think we don't really need more information. We need more information with context and a distinctive point of view behind it. And so I often think about this, and I just had a new kind of thought about this last night as I was out walking. But usually when I'm thinking about developing your point of view, it's worth kind of like identifying a few kind of core components. And so the first is what's the status quo right now? So in your niche or industry or space, wherever you want to be creating, like what's the status quo? And ideally, the thing that people are kind of frustrated with is like, things are this way, but it's not ideal because of these things. And so, whatever that's going to be. And so for me in podcasting, we can say like, okay, the status quo is like, it's pretty easy to create a podcast. It's really hard to grow one. And like, I've tried all these things and it doesn't work. So for my average kind of client or customer, they've been producing the show. It might even be high quality, and yet they've still got like 100 listeners. And they're like, why, what am I doing? This is the status quo. So that's where they're at right now. The second thing is to look at what are some of what is their kind of current desire. So the average person they're in the status quo, but they want this thing. And so they really like their show to be getting, 5,000 downloads an episode and bringing in clients or getting advertisers or sponsors or whatever. So that's where they want to be. And then the third thing is thinking about the villain. And so like, what is the thing that is keeping them from that? And so usually this is not going to be like a person or a company, but it could be some messaging that they're getting from the world. There might be like specific challenges within that space. And so we could say in podcasting, like one of the villains, there's several, is like podcasting, there's just a lot of friction in it. It's hard to get somebody to click play in the first time. It's really hard to get the show in front of somebody, let's say on social media, where they're in like 30-second or like 3-second per post viewing mode, and then listen to an hour and a half long podcast episode. Like that's just not going to happen. So there's all this kind of friction that is this villain that's inherent to this circumstance. And then there's like your proposed solution, essentially. And so if you have these 4 things, that kind of forms a pretty strong point of view where you're like status quo. So here's where you are. Here's where you want to be. Here's the thing that is keeping you from that. And then here's my proposed solution for how to get around that. That's now you've articulated something that's pretty compelling where people, and ideally the light bulb's going off where they're like, oh, I never really thought about it that way before. I never realized that this thing is actually keeping me from the goals. And actually here's this solution to get around it. And so ideally your solution is something that not everybody is talking about, because that's not really a distinctive point of view then if that's just, what everybody is already saying. But then the other thing that last night I was thinking about, I'll often add like there's personal annoyance plays a huge part in my content creation. And so I'll just notice, everybody's always talking about this thing. And I'll be like, why does everybody say that? It's just not true. It's just something that gets parroted. And that's always like my best content feels like when I just comes from a place of annoyance. I'm like, it bubbles up to the point where I'm like, I'm biting my tongue. And then finally it's like, okay, I'm just going to like write something that's kind of like, so I did one the other month where it's like, you should quit your podcast, where there's this whole thing about preaching consistency. And I think that's true to some point, but I also think some ideas just don't have the potential to grow and gain an audience.
Taking like the counterintuitive tack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was like, the best thing I ever did from a content creation perspective was I quit a podcast that wasn't working for me. I actually think it could have grown an audience, but I was like, this feels misaligned. And once I quit, I was like, oh, I don't need to like commit to something forever. It's not like every podcast I make needs to be like, oh, now I'm signing up that this is what I'm going to be known for forever. It's like, hey, I can test something. I can do 10 episodes of it. And if it's not clicking, like I can move on to something else that has more potential. And so that's one thing there. So the annoyance, but then the other piece that goes into this exploratory mindset is this kind of like skepticism. And I think that this is a good thing to incorporate when you're thinking about developing your point of view. It's like, what are the things that you're skeptical of that you can't prove are wrong, but you're like, I have this niggling feeling like that maybe this isn't true, that everybody says this, but I'm just not convinced about it. And that's now something to go and take that exploratory mindset to and start, creating content around, exploring, talking to people about, inviting on for podcast interviews or whatever that might be. And so I think when you define these things and then articulate those, like these can become a core part of your premise, but also those are going to be things that attract people to you, is by like naming the villain, articulating the status quo, and then saying like, hey, so you're here, here's the thing keeping you from there, and here's my better solution. Like now that's something that people can be like, oh, this makes logical sense, and I really like that way of approaching this challenge, and so I want to follow this person and whatever their content is. And so that's, I think, becoming with like more kind of generic content that's just flooding feeds, a lot of it AI generated, like having a distinct and like personality driven point of view is more and more important.
Yeah. And if you're new to this, you have to build the muscle of like caring what people think. You just have to kind of put it out there. Let's talk about the business side of it, because like part of this with what you do with the Podcast Marketing Academy is that you're teaching. Now we're honing in on podcasting, but you can do this with different types of content creation, is that, you attract the right people, like maybe perhaps people you want to work with. And then you have some kind of teaching, consulting, coaching, which is what you're selling them or offering them after they get into your sphere and they see what you have to offer, and then they become paying customers. And I'm just wondering trends around that space, like, because that, anything. And then we talked about you having a service before. And I think these are absolutely like, it doesn't have to be just these things, but within the bucket of like, it's just you, it's your time. And either you're investing your time, you're selling your time, or you're creating something that you sell, and something, going back to the solopreneur thing. It's like the type of business that like you could almost pretty much start in a weekend in many ways, right? Like you don't even have to have a website. You don't even have to have a successful podcast or anything. You can just make something or create a consulting package, sell your time, and start kind of selling it. And it's the quickest way to kind of have a location independent business, as long as you design it in a way that you can do it from anywhere. And, you have to think about that, because if you're like in Thailand and you're managing clients, 12 hours away, that might put you into a pickle. But around teaching, consulting, coaching packages, that kind of thing, services that you can offer, what are you seeing? I mean, what are you seeing that works? I feel like, especially with like courses, I know you have a course and coaching and stuff. Like, I feel like, and I would put you at this level. You have to be like, it has to be at such a high level that, like, if it's anything below sort of like really high quality, you're not going to be able to build something around it. I'm speaking to like courses, like coaching course type things specifically. Maybe it's different with like one-on-one consulting and stuff because it's more personality driven, more like, how do I connect with this person? Do I like their information? What are you seeing as trends? Like what are the things that are working? What are people like charging? What's kind of like, give us your best advice around that for anybody interested in exploring that path.
Yeah, I think courses are becoming harder to sell. And again, it goes back to like, there's so much, I think part of this is like, there's so much just like AI driven content, informational content that's just like flooded the world now. And this is like both, you can go to ChatGPT and ask for something, but it's also just people pumping out AI generated content in huge quantities. But usually, so like information is, there's this quote, like information wants to be free. And I think that that's a really useful way to think about it, is that like, it's going to be really hard to build a business or a product around like proprietary information, because like, even if you can do that in the short term, somebody else is going back to this idea of like content creators, it behooves them to share that information publicly. And I watched this, there's this YouTube video. It's one of Mr. Beast's old producers. It's like a 3-hour masterclass on creating YouTube videos. And I think he put thousands of hours, certainly hundreds, if not thousands of hours into creating this thing. It took him like over a year, maybe, certainly several months, if not over a year, to put this one YouTube video together. That's this 3-hour masterclass on filmmaking that is just like mind blowing. And it's like, and you just see in the comments, this is worth way more than all these YouTube courses I took. And it's like, oh, this guy, he got millions of views of this because he took something that people would normally charge thousands of dollars for and made it free on YouTube. And so I think courses are becoming more commoditized. And so I think that it goes back to the personalization of thinking about like, how can you work more intimately with like small groups of people, which you can probably charge more than for trying to sell like a course to a large number of people that's totally asynchronous. For me, I think that we're seeing a huge kind of increase in the membership model, which has been accelerating for some time. I think like a lot of those, there was a bit of it was really hyped up in the past year or two. And now we're kind of seeing like a lot of people got into memberships that kind of failed. And now we're seeing like, okay, we need to be strategic with these. It's not just like you open up a membership and like people are going to flock to it. But the way that I essentially think about my business is I give away a lot of information in the newsletter, but the point of the membership is that you get my personalized feedback and support and kind of brain in workshopping these principles with you. And so it's like, okay, I can tell you, here's how to develop an interesting concept for your podcast, but then like, you're going to get stuck there. You 100% are. And that's something that you need to workshop either with one other person who's an expert or even better as a group and be able to work through these solutions over an ongoing period of time. And so I think that that's something for like expert-led businesses where that is something that it's becoming increasingly obvious that we don't get that from social content and AI, and like the information's everywhere, but it's like we need a curator to be able to say, hey, here's all this information and people are kind of paralyzed and like, what do I do? And this is again kind of where that perspective comes in and that point of view where it's like, here's actually the small number of things to focus on. And here is a well-defined, well-articulated way to get this result where we can kind of like say, hey, ignore all this stuff, focus on this narrow sliver of stuff in this order. And like, I'll help you work on that together. And so you can do that with a course where it can be like articulating a very defined, specific type of solution to a specific problem. I think that can work. The more specific and more narrow you aim, the better. But I think like we're kind of past I would say 5 years ago, there was like big courses, which would have dozens of hours of content and like comprehensive, learn everything you need. I think now there's much more kind of appetite for a 2-hour course or workshop that you can like learn something that you can then implement that same day. I think that is something that is both, it potentially is easier to create. There's that is it the Mark Twain quote about something like, if I had more time, sorry for the length of the letter, if I had more time, I would have made it shorter, or something like that. Where it's like, yeah, a lot of times to condense knowledge and information into a smaller amount of time is more difficult. But I think that that's actually more valuable and something that's more people are signing up for. And so I think that that's a trend there. I think more the personalization, that kind of support side of things. And then I think also there's the like the service side, which you mentioned, which was also, the way that I got into the whole location independent business. It's just, I think people are there's like so much that we all feel like we have to do. And I think that having somebody who you can outsource tasks to is something that there's more and more people who are starting businesses, who are reaching the point where they're looking for support. And it's so a win for them. There's more demand. And also if you're willing to do that work, whatever it is that aligns with your skills, that's the easiest way to get started in, some kind of remote job. And I've seen that again and again and again. It takes so long to build a content or kind of course-based business, but you can kind of get within, a month, a lot of times, get fully set up with a kind of small client roster that's going to grow with a service-based business.
Cool. Is Mark Twain the most quote? Like, how can one person have so many quotes? I feel like we have to finish this episode with a Mark Twain quote now. No. Yeah. Anything else you want to share before? I mean, obviously share. Just remind people where they can find you, where they can hop on the newsletters and all that good stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. All the stuff is at podcastmarketingacademy.com/ZTT for Zero to Travel. So podcastmarketingacademy.com/ZTT. And yeah, you can find the Scrappy Podcasting newsletter there, the podcast roast that I mentioned. And I've also got, if you are a podcaster and you're curious about what some of the opportunities might be for your show, I've got a kind of 2-minute self-serve audit that you can kind of go through, answer 20 questions, and then it'll give you a kind of rating on where your show might be strong, where it might be weak, and what some of the opportunities might be there to improve it.
Sweet. And if this show fires you up and you guys actually, anybody listening, puts something out there, maybe launches a new podcast, maybe just like tweaks a newsletter they have or whatever, we'd love to just like forward it to me. I'll share it with Jeremy. We're always in touch on WhatsApp and email and stuff like that. So just like let us know, what you're doing. And I love to hear stories from the community like that. So I mean, before we let you go, I guess, give us your, you can leave us with like a sort of a quote or like a little bit of wisdom you're living by right now. But before you do that, give us like your one, like if you couldn't live in Spain or you had to spend like the next year in 2 or 3 locations that you've absolutely loved. I know you mentioned Scotland, you mentioned some of them. Can you give us like 1 or 2 other hidden gems that maybe you haven't mentioned that yet that you think like, why aren't more people going to these places? This is stupid. Like people need to start booking tickets to this place. We always love some good destination recommendations here. So
yeah, the Baltics as a whole. So this was right before COVID. We went to what was the order here? Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and all of them were quite different. But we loved all of them, and specifically the Christmas in Riga, Latvia was the most magical kind of Christmas experience that I've ever had. And so that would be one. I've been thinking a lot. I think this was 2 years ago, probably around this time we were in Zagreb, Croatia, which a lot of times, people spend a lot of time on the coast. If you go to Croatia, most people go to the coast. I really like Zagreb in a weird way. Again, it's that kind of like unpretentious, there's just something about it. I like the vibe there. And then we spent this, we found this was the only time we'd ever done this. And we'd always talked about it, where we had this period of time, 2 months, I think, before we had to go back to North America for a conference or a wedding or something like that. We're like, oh, where should we go? And we'd always talked about like, let's just open up Airbnb, put in our house parameters, find like a cool house without any kind of like guidance to country or anything like that. And so we put our budget
like
in.
Anywhere.
Yeah. And we were looking within Europe. And I think at some point we started off in Europe and we were like, okay, we want it to be like, I don't know, 1,000 euros a month or less. And we want at least 2 bedrooms. So we each have office space. We want, this other, whatever. We put in our parameters and then we just like open it up. And of course there's like thousands of listings still. And so we were like, okay, well, we got to narrow it down a little bit. I'd never been to Italy at that point. Kelly had 20 years ago and always wanted to go back. And so we then we're like, okay, well, let's maybe just narrow it down to Italy. And then we started looking, and you're just scrolling through the feed, and this one place came up, and it was just like immediately, it was almost the first one. And we were like, well, this place is pretty cool. And we just it was in this town called Ormea. It's maybe like 1,000 people, maybe 1,500. Basically, nobody speaks English. And we go there. It's in the kind of the foothillsy kind of mountains. And we spent 2 months there, and it was just incredible. And I think it's a pretty popular town in this summer for outdoorsy type stuff, mountain biking, hiking, climbing, among Germans. I think a lot of Germans come through, and probably French as well, because it's not that far from France, but nobody else, I don't think. Like, a lot of people in town spoke German and French, but not English. And for a tourism town, it's like, that's kind of curious. But there was like one great coffee shop there, and there's like 2 restaurants or 3 restaurants. I think there was like 3 pizza places and one other like pasta place or something like
Nice.
that. It was like very, very Italian. But that town, I just want to go back to all the time. We just had such an amazing time there.
Yeah, if anybody's fishing for a unique concept of like, hey, what if I just plugged in a place first and just like narrowed it down to a country and just like randomly pick an accommodation that vibes with me, and then just go there and just spend some time there. It's like another approach to travel, which I think is really cool, and ended up being one of the highlights for you. How long were you guys there?
2 months, yeah.
Okay, wow, crazy. So they got to know you around the village, I guess.
Before we got there, the mayor had been informed that we were coming, and because we had asked the host about like the Wi-Fi.
I mean, anytime the mayor's informed that just a couple people are coming, then you know it's a small town.
Yeah, our host, she was like pestering the mayor to make sure, like, oh, is the Wi-Fi? We have these Airbnb guests, they're coming, and they were asking about the Wi-Fi, and she was like trying to pester them to, I don't know, make sure that it was the fiber was coming or something like that. Maybe they were like doing renovations to the town infrastructure or something.
They like specifically brought in new fibers just for this one couple coming to their town, which is hilarious. They're like, we can't lose any more residents. We need these Oh, that's awesome. Well, I mean, maybe there's a €1 Italian village house in your future. Who knows? I do not want to ask you about how we performed in this show, because you do podcast audits and you're probably analyzing me as a host while we're talking. So I'm petrified. We'll talk about it offline. I'll take all the constructive criticism and try to improve the show in the next episode. Leave us with something. Can you leave us with something? A little bit.
I think it goes back to, like, if you're going to be creating stuff online, going back to this idea of voice, and I just feel like everything has become more fun, and not only more fun, but it's also worked better the more I've kind of just relaxed into, like, hey, I have something to say, and I can say it in my voice, and I don't need to feel like I need to, kind of run somebody else's race or play somebody else's game. And actually, like, that's not going to work for me. And the thing that's going to work is kind of being, true to myself. And so I feel like it's kind of trite advice, and I think it's really hard to do. But I think that if you can get there, it's again that idea of like releasing the handbrake. I think that that's the thing that has been so helpful for me, and I think it's encouraging to a lot of people. And I wish that I had heard that quote much earlier in my career, because I think once I heard it, I was like, oh, that feels right, and I need to stop like chasing this other thing and start kind of going more inward.
Love it. Yeah, I read a great quote today along those lines. Let go or get dragged.
That's great.
And that's same thing, kind of along those lines. And there is a bit of a letting go process, I think, around this stuff in terms of what people might think, what you might think of yourself, the inner critic and all that kind of stuff. So thanks for leaving us with that. And I'm glad we got to dive deep on this stuff because, like I said, all the way at the top to kind of tie this up, I think that, for better or worse, content creation, whatever you want to call it, can be a lot of a part of a lot of what we do as independent business owners, as small business owners. It's going to be a part of it in some way, shape, or form, most likely, whether it's a 2-sentence newsletter or, a 3-hour long YouTube, which are like a YouTube program, which took a year to make, which are 2 exact examples from this conversation. So, and all points in between. So I think that, you gave us a lot of value here and stuff to think about going into the new year as people are ramping up and getting ready to either create something new or tweak what they have. I hope this was helpful. Let us know, get in touch, and we'll link up to everything in the show notes. Jeremy, always a pleasure, my man, and I look forward to our next chat.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Cheers. There you have it. I want to just say a quick thanks to Jeremy Enns for stopping by the show and for being such a great friend over so many years. Hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to leave you with a quote that I think is just the perfect way to wrap this up. First, a quick reminder. We have a newsletter of our own over at zerototravel.com/newsletter. It's free. You can get all the latest podcast episodes. I share some personal updates, some helpful travel-related links, and much more over there. And again, that is free. Okay, as we wrap this one up with a quote from Austin Kleon. I read his book a while back, Steal Like an Artist. It's a great one. He has a great quote about finding your voice, which is something that came up today. And I think this is the perfect way to wrap this up because, we can talk about content creation. I'm using air quotes. We can talk about all of these things, but ultimately these can be tools, writing, making videos, podcasting. It can be a format that you use to provide value to other people's lives. It can be used in a variety of ways, but it can also be used to express yourself. It should be used to express yourself and who you are. It's an important thing. And I think when you get into any space like this and you see so many people expressing themselves in different ways, and they might be in your niche and you might think, oh, well, they're already, doing it in this way or that way. Don't get discouraged because you shouldn't. I mean, you're your own unique person. Like nobody is you. Nobody has your background, the way you grew up and the way your brain works and kind of filters and information and processes and shares. It's just going to be unique to you. You truly are a snowflake. I'm sorry. I know it's cliche. It might sound cheesy. Am I going into cheesy territory? I'm sorry if I am. But if you're somebody there that's been holding back on something because you feel like you're just like intimidated to put yourself out there in some way, don't be, because staying silent isn't going to serve anybody, right? The best way to get out of your own way is to just focus on the people, the customers, the clients, whatever you want to call them, your audience, whatever you're trying to build. Put the focus on them, and that completely takes the pressure off yourself, and then you have more freedom to express yourself. Which is exactly what I'm doing right now. I could kind of analyze this. I could go back and say, oh, did I say this right? Was this, I don't know. I'm going to speak from the heart here. It's what I do. And it is liberating. And some people, it might resonate with, others not, and that's okay. You can only just be yourself, right? So anyway, I'm going to leave you with this quote from Austin Kleon, who said, "The only way to find your voice is to use it. It's hardwired, built into you. Talk about the things you love. Your voice will follow." Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Peace and love to you and yours. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by zerototravel.com. Ideas and advice to make your travel dreams a reality.